By 1990, Nintendo's NES was present in 38% of American households. By 1992, the company profited more than all the American movie studios combined. With over 90% of the market share, Nintendo was the undisputed king of the video game industry. But this was about to change. Sega released their Genesis with the objective of directly taking down the NES. Nintendo started losing market share to Sega at an alarming rate, their third-party partners started to switch sides, and for the first time in years, they felt threatened. The throne was at risk, and Nintendo would do anything to keep it. And that means one single thing: war. A war that changed the industry forever. To understand why and how, let me tell you the story of two console manufacturers and how they unleashed their arsenal of hardware, software and marketing to fight for market share, without them knowing that this would define a whole generation, open the door for Titan, and change gaming forever. This is the story of the console war.
Only Atari makes the world's most popular home video games. The only space.
By 1982, Atari had sold more than 10 million units of the Atari 2600. Video games became a $2 billion industry. A new golden goose was born. Believing that it was easy money, developers rushed in, trying to make games and consoles as quickly as they could.
In television.
The intelligent.
It's the Magnavox Odyssey 2 video computer game system.
If you own ColecoVision, you already own a powerful state-of-the-art computer.
While all that was happening in the US, in Japan, Nintendo had just released their new 8-bit home console, the Famicom. With 3 successful arcade games as launch games, the Famicom quickly became the best-selling game console in Japan. And by 1985, Nintendo had sold more than 2.5 million units. With this huge success, Nintendo started looking for ways to expand, and getting into the North American market was the obvious move. But that market wasn't doing so well. That rush produced several bad games, to say the least. Millions of Pac-Man and E.T. copies were returned or thrown out. This incident would haunt the industry for a long time. With no light at the end of the tunnel, retailers and consumers lost confidence in video games. There was just too many mediocre consoles to choose from and too many bad games out there, and the rise of home computers was the last nail on the coffin. The golden goose was dead. The video game industry revenues dropped from $3 billion to just 100. The video game market crashed. So for Nintendo, releasing a console in 1985 would have been a huge risk. The video game market was still recovering from the crash. The March 1985 issue of Electronic Games magazine stated that, considering that the video game market in America has virtually disappeared, this could be a miscalculation on Nintendo's part. Or at least, that's what everybody thought.
Will you be the one to experience the Nintendo Entertainment System? Comes with Rob, Zapper, Control Deck, 2 controllers, Gyromite, and Duck Hunt.
Despite all the concerns, in October 18, 1985, Nintendo released the Famicom with 17 launch games in the US, under the name of the Nintendo Entertainment System. To convince the NA consumers that the NES was different from the old consoles, it was marketed as an entertainment system that required you to insert game packs into a control deck. But those awful games were still fresh in the memory of the players. To ensure something like E.T. would never happen again, Nintendo put in place strict licensing terms. 1. They validated every game themselves before the distribution. 2. The developers weren't allowed to release the games on other consoles. And 3. They were restricted to a maximum of 5 games a year. But even this would not be enough. so Nintendo added their seal of quality on licensed games, and finally implemented a lockout chip, keeping out any unlicensed and potentially awful games. And the combination of all these steps worked to perfection.
Video game craze to sweep the United States and Japan. It's called Nintendo.
Nintendo single-handedly revived the multi-billion-dollar industry and automatically put themselves on the throne. Nintendo sold 1.1 million consoles in 1986 and owned over 80% of the market share. Nintendo became the undisputed king, and with their licensing terms and guidelines, they were here to stay. But what they didn't know is that they reopened the door for some tough competitors. Nintendo was the king, but for how long can they keep that spot?
Only from Nintendo. Now you're playing with power. Nintendo Entertainment System. Your parents help you hook it up.
In the early 80s, Sega was one of the top 5 arcade game manufacturers in the US, but by 1982, the video game crash of '83 was rapidly approaching. The company was hurt and needed something new, so as every other company, they hopped on the home console train.
Sega Video Game SG-1000.
While the video game crash occurred in the US, in Japan, Sega released their first ever home console, the SG-1000. While it had sold 160,000 units in Japan, a huge success for Sega and for first console, it didn't put a dent on Nintendo's market share. The SG-1000 was outsold 10-1 by the NES, so within 2 years, it was replaced by the Sega Mark III, known as the Master System in North America.
Only on the Sega system. Sega, the challenge will always...
While it was success in Europe and Brazil, in North America and Japan, it still didn't manage to catch the interest of the public. So again, Sega's R&D team was immediately back to the drawing board. This time, they tried to leverage one of their strengths, their arcade technology. So the idea for their new upcoming console was to modify their System 16 hardware, the same that ran their arcade games, and make it as an arcade home system. The System 16 would provide better graphics and better sound. The console was also designed with the possibility of future use of a mouse, keyboard, floppy disk drive, modem, and graphics tablet. The result was a home console that surpassed anything on the market at that time. With sleek black look and 16-bit written in gold on the console, the Sega Mega Drive was born. But once again, the launch of the Mega Drive in Japan was eclipsed by Nintendo. Super Mario Bros. 3 was released a week earlier, and that was getting all the attention. But in the end, Sega managed to sell 400,000 units the first year. In the first place, trying to beat Nintendo in Japan was impossible. From the beginning, the real battlefield was the American market. So in the summer of 1989, with some appearance changes, Sega released the Mega Drive under the name Genesis. At $199 and with 8 launch titles, their objective was to sell 1 million copies during the first year. And so the first big ad campaign was launched. Genesis does what Nintendo don't. I will let the full ad play for you to see how aggressive these ads were.
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo Genesis.
Does.
Genesis.
Does.
Genesis.
Does.
Genesis.
Does.
Genesis does.
Get Joe Montana free, Pat Riley free, Buster Douglas free, Super Monaco GP free, or Collins free. What
Sega managed to only sell 500,000 units by mid-1990, far from their objective. If they really wanted to beat Nintendo, a change was necessary. And that change came as Tom Kalinske. Before becoming the CEO of Sega of America, Tom Kalinske was known for his work at Mattel. He's credited with reviving the Barbie and Hot Wheels brands, and with the Genesis does what Nintendo don't ad campaign, there was no turning back. Sega declared total war on Nintendo, and with Tom Kalinske as the new CEO of Sega of America, they were ready to fight. And fight they did. At first, Sega sold consoles to anyone they could, and mostly to hardcore teenage gamers that were interested in the new 16-bit technology. These guys saw the NES as an obsolete and childish 8-bit console. Slowly, the Genesis started to become cool and edgy. By making sports and mature games, Sega pushed this image, and to make the console more appealing, the price of the Genesis was lowered from $199 to $149. But there was one last thing that bothered Kalinske: Altered Beast. Altered Beast was the game that was bundled with the console. It was a cool game, but far from the best. Sega knew that it is the software that sells the hardware, and Nintendo has been successfully doing this for a long time. They always bundled their consoles with their best games. If people could only play Super Mario Bros., they would still buy an NES. Sega needed a game, a character, a rival that can compete or even surpass Nintendo's mascot. Sega needed their own Mario.
What's this one? Oh, this is a Sonic the Hedgehog from Sega Genesis. Hey, look at these radical colors, huh? Wow, Sonic's fast, too. No, over here. I like Genesis, and it costs a lot less. Wait, kid, that game I'll take Sonic and Genesis. I knew that.
Sonic was cool. Sonic was edgy. Sonic was fast. And Sonic was a huge hit. The more mature audience of Sega loved the new character. Nothing on the market compared to Sonic the Hedgehog. The game was fast, the graphics were impressive, and the colors were vibrant. Sonic was the first big hit that Nintendo really felt, and they needed to react. And for the first time, the Titan was starting to move, or forced to move. A rumor that Nintendo was working on a 16-bit console was out, and it was quickly confirmed. Just 2 months after Sega released Sonic the Hedgehog, in August 1991, Nintendo released their new 16-bit console, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System.
Now you're playing with power, superpower.
The release of the Super NES finally put Nintendo at the same level as Sega, at least in terms of hardware. This meant everything will depend on the marketing and the quality of the software, but there was a problem. Nintendo was already losing on both fronts, even before releasing their console. Sega had 150 playable games on the Genesis versus 8 on the Super Nintendo, and the same for the marketing. While Nintendo's ads seemed stuck, trying to appeal to young kids and trying to keep that family-friendly image, Sega pushed even more their edgy and cool image. By now, a new phenomenon emerged. Every Sega commercial ended with the Sega scream. Sega was becoming cool to high school and college students, and the cooler Sega became, the less people were ready to admit that they liked Nintendo. But even all this was not enough to dethrone Nintendo. Thanks to games like Super Mario World and Zelda, the Super NES was doing good. By the end of 1991, Nintendo sold 3.4 million units of their new console, all this thanks to several years of dominance. While they were holding the #1 spot, they cemented their position, and especially in terms of retail. At this time, Nintendo accounted for 10% of Walmart's profit. To keep any competitors from entering the market, Nintendo used some very unorthodox methods for maintaining superiority. Walmart and other stores were pressured into not carrying Sega products, and Sega knew that having great console, great games, and great marketing is a very important thing. But if you can't sell your products, all that would be for nothing. Retail space is everything, and Nintendo had it all. But Sega had something that others in this business hadn't: perseverance. Sega opened Sega Game Store just in front of Walmart headquarters in Arkansas and put as many TVs and Genesis consoles as they could and let people play for free. But when the players left satisfied and walked into Walmart to buy a Genesis, it was not there. With the huge popularity of the Sega Game Store and after many rejections, Walmart finally gave in and gave Sega a 4-foot section in their stores, and most retailers followed shortly after. After the Super Nintendo had been on the market for a year, its price was lowered to $149 to match that of the Genesis. As a result, Sega lowered the price of the Genesis again to $129. Although Sega was close, they needed a little push to overtake Nintendo. The release of Sonic 2 was a huge boost, and they were even closer to beating Nintendo. But what they didn't know was that the decisive moment in this console war would be Mortal Kombat. Since the crash of '83, the arcade industry didn't fully recover. The glory days were behind, or at least until Street Fighter 2 was released. The game is considered a revolutionary moment in the fighting game genre. But not only that, Street Fighter 2 revived the arcade industry, and as always, other companies jumped in. In 1992, Nintendo acquired a slightly modified version of the game on Super Nintendo, and in 1993 they were followed by Sega with their own version of the game named Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition. But once again, the two companies were in a stalemate, and that's when another company jumped in. Midway Games. In 1992, they released their new game in arcades, named Mortal Kombat. Compared to other fighting games at that time, Mortal Kombat was more violent. You could see blood everywhere during fights, and you can finish your opponents with one of the fatalities. The game also had great mechanics and combos, and it quickly became a huge hit in arcades. It had such success that both Nintendo and Sega knew that they needed the game on their consoles, and in 1993 they both acquired the game. But Nintendo made a mistake. A huge mistake. Mortal Kombat was a perfect fit for Sega's cool and edgy image, but for Nintendo it was the exact opposite. Nintendo knew the importance of Mortal Kombat and knew that they needed to have the game on the Super NES, but the problem was their audience and their own guidelines. To release the game, Nintendo made a new version. Clean version. They changed the color of blood to green and they removed the fatalities. This was their mistake. Nintendo were receiving letters from players complaining about censorship. On the other hand, players could have the full arcade experience on the Genesis, and in the end, Mortal Kombat was the deciding factor for many people's purchases. Mortal Kombat on the Genesis outsold the Nintendo version by 3-1. This is what Sega needed. This was the little push that helped tip the scale. Sega was out earlier, priced cheaply, and provided both what people wanted and what their rivals weren't supplying. Finally, everything was in place. From around 8%, Sega had 55% control of the market, and by 1993, they had more than quadrupled their net worth, up to $3.6 billion. Sega outsold Nintendo for 3 consecutive holiday seasons, and finally held the #1 spot. Sega was the new king.
Hurry up. From Santa? Yeah. Hurry up. I was my Santa Genesis. Yeah, oh my god!
No.
Oh my god, oh my god!
Nintendo never saw Sega as a threat. Sega was a small company doing business in the arcade industry. It was too specialized and small to be a danger. Or at least that's what Nintendo thought. Nintendo had an idea. If you are alone in an industry, you are automatically the king, and their number one objective was to suppress any competition. But this backfired. Healthy competition is very beneficial to any industry. Nintendo's biggest vulnerability was their own success. Their dominance led to stagnation, and that in turn made them lower their guard. Sticking with old technology opened the door for Sega and their 16-bit console, and that head start was everything. Sega forced Nintendo to evolve, and that exact evolution changed gaming forever. The licensing terms from that time are still in use to this day, and it is in that period that gaming became a real and solid entertainment pillar. It's in that period that people understood that gaming was a real thing, and it will be around for some more time. But not only that, it's this period that saw the birth of a third giant. The war between Sega and Nintendo opened the door for Sony, and if both Nintendo and Sega didn't change gaming, PlayStation for sure did. The kids and teenagers who witnessed the console war were the ones who also witnessed the internet go mainstream, and they were the ones who carried their ideas into the first gaming forums. What consoles they had and what games they played was taken as a projection of their own personalities. What you played was who you were, and who you were was everything. And this didn't change a bit.